My name is Russell West. I was 38 when this started, and I had spent my whole life in the same stretch of Appalachian hills where folks measured a man by whether he showed up, fixed what broke, and kept family business off other people's porches. I had never been the type to chase ghost stories or cryptid talk. I worked nights in town at the coal prep plant, came home before dawn with dust in my teeth and my shoulders locked up from vibration, slept through late morning and handled the property chores before supper. That routine was my proof, to myself and everybody else, that I lived in the real world. Lila and I stayed on her father Emmett's land, a folded hollow outside Blackwater Ridge, where the road narrowed to one lane and then gave up pretending to be county maintained. The house sat on a rise above a creek cut, with a split-rail fence around the yard, 2 old sycamores leaning behind the storm cellar, and a line of timber that started close enough to make the back porch feel like a tree stand at night. Emmett's trailer was 100 yards down the slope near the machine shed, close enough for him to wander up if a line froze or a breaker tripped, far enough that everybody could keep their own temper. The arrangement worked because we did what families out there have always done. We traded labor instead of favors. I kept the fences sound, rotated feed, checked culverts after hard rain, and handled anything that needed a welder. Emmett let us use the upper pasture and the big garden strip. Lila kept books for a hardware supplier in town, from a desk by the kitchen window, headset on, pencil tucked in her hair, steady as a metronome, even when the internet dropped and she had to hotspot off my phone. Most workdays followed the same shape. I clocked out at 4:15 in the morning, drove 26 minutes up 2 ridges, with the heater coughing and the radio low, parked by the side steps so I could slip in without waking her, and showered until the water ran gray. Lila usually left a covered plate on the stove. I ate standing up, rinsed my dish, and set out 1 clean shirt for the next shift. By 5:30, the first bird started. By 6, I was in bed, earplugs in, blackout curtains closed tight enough to make noon feel like midnight. I woke around 11:30, drank coffee strong enough to strip varnish, and took inventory of the day in my head before my boots hit the porch. Trap line by the lower creek if rain had eased. Salt block for the far pasture if the barrel was low. Scope check on the 30-06 every Sunday whether I had plans to hunt or not. I had a way of moving through tasks that made me feel useful and calm, and for years that was enough. The hollow had its own soundtrack, and I knew it the way you know your own breathing. Wind coming down through tulip poplar made a soft rushing that changed pitch before weather shifted. Squirrels rattled leaves in stop-start bursts. Coyotes called from the opposite ridge line most evenings, never close, just enough to remind the hounds they still had jobs. We had 2 hounds, Buck and June, both old enough to listen and young enough to sprint fence to fence when a rabbit cut across the yard. They barked at everything with fur and some things without it. Delivery truck, possum, thunder, a hat on a fence post if it hadn't been there yesterday. Their noise was a nuisance and a comfort because barking told you the world was following rules. Emmett and I were not close in the way television men are close with their fathers-in-law, but we had workable terms. He was 63, broad in the chest, bad left knee, hands like knots in seasoned oak. He talked in short lines and watched longer than he spoke. And he had a private streak I figured came from raising kids through lean years without help from anybody. He drank 2 fingers of whiskey most nights, never sloppy, and watched weather radar with the same expression he used for everything else. Flat. Unreadable. I used to think he did that to keep leverage in every conversation. Later I learned there was another reason he kept his face quiet. One Sunday in early October, after 3 days of intermittent rain, I walked down behind the house to clear wet leaves from the stone steps to the storm cellar. The cellar sat half buried in the hill. Concrete walls poured before I was born. Double wood doors on steel strap hinges, and an old hand winch bolted to a post for lifting feed sacks in and out when Emmett still stored grain there. I carried a flat shovel, a 5-gallon bucket, and the mild resentment that comes from doing damp work on your one day without a shift. I remember this clearly because I actually laughed at myself once, standing there with my boots sliding on wet oak leaves, thinking I'd become the kind of man who scheduled his annoyance between laundry and scope cleaning like it was a respectable hobby. Then I saw the gouges. They ran diagonally across the outer door, 6 deep grooves in 2 sets, parallel and straight enough to look deliberate. Each cut was almost as long as my forearm. The paint was peeled back in curled strips, pale wood exposed underneath, fibers frayed and damp from rain. I crouched and put my fingers in one channel. It was wide, roughly the thickness of my thumb, and too clean at the edges for random storm debris. A chain had not done that. A rake had not done that. Old damage looked weathered and soft. This looked recent. I stood there longer than I meant to, running possible explanations. Misplaced loader bucket. Metal tine from the hay spear dragged wrong. Some prank with a farm implement. I had seen bored men do dumber things after payday. At supper I brought it up plain. "Somebody raked the cellar with steel claws or what?" I said, and Lila looked up from her plate first, then at Emmett. He kept chewing, swallowed, and took a sip of tea. "What marks?" he said. "The 6 cuts across the door, fresh wood showing." He set his fork down, wiped his mouth, and said, "Settler-era tool damage. Door's older than all of us." Lila frowned. "That door got replaced when I was in middle school." Emmett's eyes shifted to her just once. Outer skin did. Frame didn't. You can't trust what looks fresh in wet weather. I opened my mouth to push it, then closed it. At that table, pressure made him lock up harder, and I had no appetite for a long argument before a night shift. Still, a primary rule around equipment was simple. If you could catch a fingernail in a new split, it was new. Those grooves caught my whole finger. By the second week of October, I started noticing changes that did not fit any pattern I trusted. Buck and June stopped crossing the back fence after dusk. At first I thought they had found a den and gotten disciplined by a protective sow, because they came up from the tree line with their ears pinned and moved stiffly for half an hour. But then it happened again and then again. They would trot out toward the timber like usual, noses down, tails level, then halt as if they had hit an invisible boundary. Not freeze, recoil. Their weight shifted backward, paws scraping dirt, low whine in their throats, and both of them backed toward the porch without taking their eyes off the same gap between the sycamores. Buck once tucked his tail so tight it brushed his belly and climbed the steps sideways, trying to keep that section of yard in view. I had seen those dogs stand their ground against coyotes and a young black bear that wandered in during berry season. I had never seen them ask the house for cover. Nights grew segmented in a way that worked on my nerves even before I admitted it. There would be full minutes with no sound at all. No insect noise, no rustle, no far highway hum carried across the ridge. Just a kind of pressure like holding your breath without meaning to. Then one heavy footfall somewhere behind the cellar. One. Not a run, not a series. Just a single weight transfer with intent in it. A deer stepping blind through brush made 2 or 3 quick corrections, and a branch snap. This was different. Deliberate and spaced out, like something testing the ground before each step. I started timing gaps on my watch when I sat on the porch after waking for shift. 30 seconds, 90, 3 minutes. Then another thud. Closer or farther, hard to judge in wet air. I told myself fatigue was sharpening shadows into stories. Night shift did that, especially in shoulder season when dawn came late and rain sat in the hollows. I ran checks, because that is what I do before I worry. I walked the fence line and looked for bear rub on posts. Nothing. I checked for loose livestock from the neighboring ridge that might be pushing through and leaning weight into our rails. No hair on splinters, no hoof cuts in mud. I scanned for prank tracks from kids with side-by-sides. No tire marks past the creek crossing. I checked hinge stress on the cellar doors and looked for old warping that could mimic fresh damage. The wood was dry beneath surface moisture, solid, no twist. I even pulled a level and tape measure because I wanted numbers, not feelings. Everything squared within reason except the gouges, and those measured wrong for any tool I owned. The odor came after rain, and once I noticed it, I could not ignore it. Wet musk first. Heavy and animal, but not like dog kennel, not like fox, not like bear either. Bear had a sour sweet rot to it when they stayed close. This was sharper, mixed in with coal dust that seemed out of place that far from my truck, and a metallic tang that reminded me of old blood on a skinning knife after you rinse it but catch the smell in the handle seam anyway. The scent pooled strongest near the cellar doors and the path to the sycamores. I found myself stopping there with my head tilted, trying to separate notes the way I did with fuel leaks, diesel, oil, coolant. Each one had a signature. This had one too. Organic, damp, predatory. Lila saw me standing in the drizzle one afternoon with the bucket forgotten by my boot and said, "Russ, you are running hot. You look like you have not slept in a week." "I slept," I said. "You slept in pieces. That is not the same thing." "I am hearing steps at night." "Deer." "Deer don't make the dogs do that." She set her mug on the porch rail and crossed her arms against the damp. "You are up all night around conveyor noise and backup alarms. Then you come home and listen for trouble. Anybody would hear trouble. Take 2 evenings off the checks. Eat, shower, bed. Please." She was not dismissing me to be cruel. She was trying to keep our life upright with practical advice, and on paper she was right. Exhaustion amplifies threat signals. Pattern seeking gets noisy. I knew all that, and I wanted her explanation to hold, because it kept our world ordinary. But each night gave me one more hard detail that did not fit the frame. 3 days later, right before dawn, I stepped out to dump coffee grounds and caught Buck and June standing shoulder to shoulder at the porch edge, both facing the cellar. Neither barked. Their chests vibrated with a low warning I felt through the boards more than heard. Mist sat knee-high over the grass, and the motion sensor by the back steps flicked on, then off, then on again, as if something kept entering the edge of its arc and withdrawing. I grabbed my flashlight from the hook by the door, thumbed it to high, and swept the beam across the fence, then the sycamores, then the cellar doors. Nothing moved, but the gouges shone pale where the paint had peeled, bright as bone in the light. When I clicked the beam off, The dark seemed to press inward, faster than usual, and in that moment I understood something I had resisted for weeks. Whatever had scored that door hadn't done it once and left. It was still ranging the property, close enough for the dogs to smell, close enough to trigger lights, close enough that silence arrived before it did. I clicked the flashlight back on and kept it low, not sweeping wide this time, just holding a tight cone on the grass between the steps and the fence, as if discipline could force the night to answer. Buck pressed against my shin. June stayed half behind him, nails scraping the porch boards every time the motion light snapped bright and then died again. The sensor was old but not faulty. I had replaced it in July and tested the range myself. Something was stepping into that edge and easing back out over and over, patient as a man checking whether a door was latched. I eased the rifle from the rack by the kitchen door, worked the bolt, and stayed on the top step until dawn bled into the hollow in the thin gray layers. No shape showed itself. No branch moved. But when first light finally reached the cellar path, there were 4 new cuts across the lower door panel, fresh wood curled outward, the shavings still damp. I went down with the dogs at my heels, and they stopped hard 10 feet from the steps, both of them whining like they had hit an electric fence. I kept moving alone. Up close, the marks were too uniform to be random damage, spaced like fingers from a hand that had no business being that big. Each groove sat deep enough that my pocket knife blade disappeared to the hilt when I checked. The smell pooled there, stronger than the day before. Wet hide and metal and dirt turned over from underneath. I stood and scanned the slope behind the cellar. Mud had gathered where runoff crossed the path, and something had stepped through it. Not once, but several times. The impressions were partial, edges slumped from water, yet one thing held. The 4-foot shape looked canine at first glance, then wrong when you stayed with it. The heel sat too long, like a stretched print from a mold that did not fit. Lila came out in my old flannel with her hair braided and her phone in her hand, not looking at the screen, just holding it like a habit. She saw the new gouges and stopped talking mid-sentence. For a minute, all 3 of us stood there listening to nothing. "Russ," she said quietly, "come up to the porch." "Not yet." "You can't fix this with a shovel." "I can at least see what did it." She hugged herself tighter and looked at the tree line instead of the door. "Then see it from up here?" I did what she asked because she was shaking and trying not to show it. We got the dogs inside, dead-bolted both doors, and sat at the kitchen table with the lights on full, even though daylight had already filled the room. I called the plant and took a personal day, first one in almost 8 months. Around noon, I walked the whole perimeter with a tape measure, marking anything that looked disturbed. Near the split rail, I found one clump of dark, coarse hair snagged on a nail head where no livestock passed, and halfway to the creek, I found a section of grass laid flat in an oval like something heavy had crouched and waited there. That evening, Emmett came up with a roll of chain and 3 new hasps. He did not ask what happened. He looked once at the door, nodded, and set his jaw. "You saw it?" I asked while he held the drill steady. "I saw enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough to add steel." He drove screws with short, hard bursts, then handed me the wrench without meeting my eyes. We looped chain across both cellar handles and cinched it tight. He tested the pull twice, then stepped back. "Why chain a storm door from the outside?" I said. "If weather turns, we need fast access." "We got a root cellar in the trailer," he said. "Use that." This makes no sense. Most useful advice I can give you, he said, voice flat as gravel, is stop expecting sense. By the third night after those new gouges, clouds had dropped low enough to snag the ridge tops, and the power flickered in short brownouts that made the kitchen clock reset itself twice. I finished checking fence staples by headlamp and came up to the porch around 9. Buck and June were already there, pressed to the siding with their ears pinned. I heard one footfall behind the sycamores, then another farther right, then silence so complete I could hear the ticking of the porch bulb, cooling between flickers. The motion light triggered, went dark, triggered again. I stood with the flashlight ready and told myself it was an injured bear pacing. Told myself a bear could learn a yard. Told myself the smell on the wind was just damp leaves and my own fear pulling old scents forward. Then 2 reflections appeared above the far fence line, amber green and level with my chest. Too far apart for one small animal, too steady for fireflies or lens artifact. They blinked out of sequence, left then right, and held there watching me. I locked the beam on them. The lights vanished as if someone had covered them with a hand. I waited 20 minutes. Nothing came back. When I turned to bring the dogs in, June let out a choked bark toward the cellar and bolted through the open door so hard she slipped on the linoleum. I shut us in and kept the rifle across my knees until morning. At dawn, I found fresh mud smeared on the porch post at shoulder height, plus 3 shallow scoring lines in the paint, where something had tested the wood and not committed to tearing through. Predatory was no longer a theory. Something had closed distance to the house, then backed off on purpose. I spent the next day building explanations because that was the only way I knew to keep panic from taking over. First model was bear. Black bears could stand and reach, could peel wood, could move quiet when they wanted. But bear prints were broad and plantigrade, and what I had by the cellar ran long with a narrow midsection and claw placement forward like a canid. Second model was feral dog pack. Packs tested lights, pushed boundaries, and circled structures. Yet packs made chaotic sign, many overlapping tracks and scattered movement. This thing traveled in a line and returned to the same points, like it had a map. Third model was person, somebody in boots and gloves, maybe drunk, maybe mean, maybe trying to run us off. I followed that model hard for an hour because human malice, while ugly, at least stayed in known categories. Then I measured those gouges again. No hand tool gave that spacing with that pressure unless mounted to machinery. And there were no tire tracks to support machinery anywhere near the cellar. I drove into town for plaster at the hardware store and took a sack of feed as cover for why I was buying 2 kits on a Wednesday. At the counter, I mentioned odd prints to Hank Bell, who hunted every season and had opinions about everything with fur. Could be a big shepherd mix, he said. People dump dogs all over these roads. Big enough to clear my top rail without touching it? He shrugged. Rails rot. Maybe it brushed and you didn't see. I saw the rail. Dust still on top. He gave me that half-smile men use when they think you are spiraling and they are trying to keep you from embarrassment. You're running nights, Russ. Lack of sleep turns squirrels into outlaws. I laughed because not laughing would have started an argument in aisle 3. On the drive back, I caught myself checking the rear view every few seconds for no reason I could defend. I hated that. I had always trusted my own calibration. Now every shadow made a claim. By late afternoon, I had 2 decent casts from impressions near the creek crossing where mud held shape. I sprayed release, poured plaster, and guarded the sites while they set, swatting gnats and replaying details in my head. 19 inches between repeated rear impressions on the cleanest line. That stride could happen in a bound, but the depth pattern suggested controlled walking, not sprinting. The front impressions showed 4 toe marks with claw points, yet the rear carried a heel extension that made no sense for a normal canine. I took photos with a tape beside each print, then bagged the casts in old pillowcases and labeled date, time, and location in marker. Evidence calmed me, because evidence was something you could stack, store, and compare when your memory started arguing with itself. That night after supper, I brought 1 cast to the table and set it on a folded towel between the salt and the napkin holder. Lila looked from me to Emmett and then back at the cast. "Tell me what that is," I said. Lila touched the edge with 1 finger. "A track." "From what?" She shook her head. "I don't know, Russ." I turned to Emmett. "You said Cellar tool marks. This isn't a tool." He stared at the plaster for a long moment. "Could be washed out coyote sign. Coyotes don't leave heels like that. Erosion does strange things. Then come look at the originals." He pushed his chair back slow and stood. "You want my honest answer? I think you're feeding this. Every hour you spend measuring mud is 1 hour less sleeping, and that makes you jump at normal noise." The words landed hard because they came from the 2 people whose judgment I trusted most. I carried the cast to the mudroom shelf and set it down harder than I meant to. For the rest of the evening, we moved around each other careful and quiet, like we were guests in our own house. 2 days passed with rain on and off. I kept working my checks and added new ones. Flour dusted across the cellar threshold each dusk. Fishing line with small bells on the back gate. Spare batteries in every flashlight. Truck parked nose out for a fast departure. Every morning the flour showed disturbance from the same direction, never random. A drag at the edge like claws lifting late. The bells stayed silent. That bothered me more than if they had rung. It meant whatever moved through that yard either noticed the line or avoided contact by instinct that looked a lot like planning. I called county wildlife from the porch, while Lila listened through the screen door. I reported large prints, aggressive property damage, unusual behavior near residents. The man on dispatch asked if I had livestock losses. I said no. He asked if I had photos. I said yes. He said resources were stretched and advised securing trash, feed, and pet food because black bears were active before denning. I repeated that I had canid-like impressions with abnormal heel geometry. He paused long enough for me to hear keyboard clicks, then said, "Sir, bear tracks can deform in mud. Avoid direct contact and call emergency if threat is immediate." Officially polite, functionally done. After that call, Lila stood beside me on the porch and watched Buck pace from door to door. "Maybe we go stay with my sister for a week," she said, "and leave Emmett here alone? He can come too." "He won't." "Then what are you waiting for?" I looked at the tree line and heard myself answer with a certainty I did not feel. One clean explanation. She held my gaze a second longer than usual, then nodded once like she was filing away a fact about me that would matter later. That evening, Emmett asked me to walk down to the cellar with him just after dark. No whiskey in his hand, no small talk, just a flashlight and a key ring I'd never seen before. heavy with old brass keys worn smooth. We went in silence. The chain I had installed hung loose on one side, not broken, just unhooked. I knew I had latched it that afternoon. He crouched, checked the hasp, then stood and ran his beam across the doors. Fresh splinters curled from 3 new grooves near the latch, pale against wet paint. Each one cut through the line where the chain had sat, as if whatever made them had tested metal first and wood second. I heard breathing then, not from Emmett, not from me. Slow, deep, somewhere beyond the sycamores where the ground dropped to the creek cut. Buck and June were up at the house, and the sound was too heavy for either dog anyway. Emmett's flashlight trembled once and steadied. He slipped the key into the cellar lock, turned it, pocketed it, and set his jaw hard enough that the muscles jumped. "If it circles," he said without looking at me, "you stay inside till daylight." I turned toward the sound, and every muscle in my back locked at once, the way it does when cold water hits a fresh cut. Emmett lifted his flashlight and held it steady on the sycamores, but the beam only reached the first trunks before fog swallowed it. The breathing came again, slow and heavy. Not wind, not machinery, not anything that panted in quick cycles. It had rhythm to it, control. In through a big chest, out through teeth. "What is it?" I said, quiet but not calm. He did not answer the question. "Back up," he said. "Now." He moved me with his free hand, palm flat to my shoulder blade, guiding me up the path without ever turning his back on the trees. The beam tracked left to right in short sweeps, never high, never wide. That told me he was searching for a body close to the ground, something he expected to charge low. We had gone maybe 15 feet when the motion light at the porch snapped on and lit the upper yard in a hard white cone. The cellar and trees stayed black. Then the light died. No fade, no flicker. Just gone. The hollow went dark except for Emmett's flashlight. And in that dark, I saw 2 points come up above the split rail fence, amber green and fixed, far enough apart that they could not belong to a deer looking through brush. They sat at my chest level. Waist-deep weeds ran along that stretch of fence, and whatever owned those reflections stood behind them, without bobbing or shifting, as if rooted. I knew the exact height of that fence because I had rebuilt one section in spring. Top rail at 42 inches. Those lights were at least a foot above that. I stopped moving. Emmett kept inching backward and hissed, "Russell, move." The eyes blinked, left then right, not in sync, and the second they opened again, they were aimed where my face had been before I flinched. Tracking. Not random glare. I snapped my flashlight up beside Emmett's and hit full power. The beam crossed the rail, caught fog and wet grass, and gave me nothing. No body, no shape, just empty yard and sycamore trunks, slick with rain. "Keep coming," Emmett said. We reached the porch steps and climbed without taking our eyes off the fence gap. I thumbed my light off and on, trying to catch shine. Nothing. Buck slammed against the screen door from inside, barking now in sharp bursts that sounded angry until you heard the pitch and realized it was fear dressed like anger. June stayed behind him, whining so hard she coughed between sounds. Lila opened the door 2 inches and whispered, "Get in here." Then saw our faces and pulled it wide. We locked both doors, shut off the room lights, and watched through the kitchen window because bright rooms turn glass into mirrors. Emmett stood at one side of the sink with his flashlight angled down to avoid back glare. I took the other side with the rifle, muzzle low, safety on. Lila hovered behind us, one hand on the counter, the other gripping my sleeve hard enough to numb my arm. Nothing moved for 3 minutes, maybe 4. Then Buck gave one strangled growl and backed away from the window without turning around. I followed his line and saw the 2 reflections again, farther right now, near the run where the fence dipped toward the creek path. Same height, same color. They held for 2 heartbeats, then winked out one at a time. Lila whispered, "Tell me that was a coyote." I said, "Coyotes don't stand that tall." Emmett finally spoke, voice thin with effort. "Don't narrate it, just watch." We watched until dawn pushed enough gray into the yard to kill reflections. Nobody sat down. Nobody made coffee. At first light, Emmett stepped onto the porch with me, and we checked the ground from the top step before committing weight. The grass below the window was laid flat in 2 narrow lanes, parallel, as if something heavy had paced back and forth on the same line through the night. Near the fence dip, we found one partial impression where damp soil held shape. 4 toes, claw points forward, heel too long. The print was deeper at the front than the rear, like weight shifted toward the toes, the way runners load before sprinting. I took photos with my phone, tape measure beside each one, and shot a short video, panning from fence rail to impression to the sycamores so nobody could claim I staged scale. Emmett did not object, but he would not step into frame either. Lila stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, even though the morning was mild, watching us with a look I had only seen once before, when her mother died, and she needed facts faster than grief could process. By 7, the rain started again in thin needles. I went back down alone to check the cellar chain, still hooked. Fresh scrape marks on the outer link, bright metal under rust, as if nails had drawn over it and slipped. I put my thumb in one scrape and felt burrs curled outward, made from outside pressure. Not old, not accidental. When I came back up, Emmett was at the table with his key ring spread in front of him like poker chips. He separated one long brass key and slid it into his shirt pocket. Lila poured 3 cups of coffee and no one drank. I set my phone on the table and played the video. The shot shook because my hands shook, but the numbers on the tape were clear. "That's not deer, not dog, not bear," I said. Emmett stared at the paused frame and rubbed his jaw. "It sees light and adjusts. That's what matters." Lila looked from him to me. "You said if it circles. You didn't say if anything circles. You said it like you knew." He did not answer for a long stretch. Rain ticked against the window. Finally, he said, "Knowing and naming aren't the same thing." I felt something hard turn over in my chest, then part anger, part dread. "I'm done with half answers. You want me protecting this place, you tell me what you think is out there." He shook his head once. "You won't like what I think. Try me. I think it learns habits. I think it tests doors before it commits. I think it likes this hill because something under it gives cover." He stood, took his cup to the sink untouched, and added without looking back, "And I think talking about it like it's a story invites carelessness." That was Emmett's way. Hand you a warning shaped like a rule, then disappear before you could argue details. He left for the trailer to check his generator fuel, and I stood at the table with my own reflection in the dark microwave glass, looking older than I had the week before. I told myself the eyes had been reflection from some odd angle, maybe 2 animals aligned in depth. I told myself how fear had stretched distance and height. I told myself exhaustion made precise measurement feel less precise than it really was. The problem was not that I lacked explanations. The problem was that each explanation required me to ignore one specific physical fact, and those facts kept stacking in a neat pile that did not care what I preferred to believe. By that evening, cloud cover finally broke and gave us one clear stretch with a hard moon and a temperature drop sharp enough to sting your nose. I slept in fragments through the day and woke after sunset to a house lit by 2 lamps and the stove hood because the main line had browned out twice already. Lila had packed a bag in plain sight by the mudroom bench. Clothes, charger, meds, important papers in a zipper folder. She did not announce it. Mom made sure I saw it. Substation text says rolling outages till midnight, she said while she stirred chili. Eat now while we've got heat. Emmett came up 10 minutes later carrying 2 lanterns and a jerry can for the backup generator. We checked fuel, checked extension cords, checked porch bulbs. Routine gave our hands jobs while our minds spun. At 9:23, the power went out clean across the hollow. No transformer pop, no sputter, just instant dark, and then moonlight flooding every window in silver blue sheets. The first minutes of an outage are always louder than normal because appliances stop and you hear the house settle. Refrigerator hum gone, vent fan gone, just floor creaks and your own breathing. Then another layer dropped out. No crickets, no frog calls from the creek. Silence thick enough to make the lantern flame hiss sound bright. Emmett and I stepped onto the porch with 1 lantern each while Lila stayed inside by the kitchen door with her phone and the keys. The moon sat above the east ridge, bright enough to cast fence shadows across the yard. Fog climbed from the creek in low bands, not dense, just enough to blur edges. The 2 dead sycamores behind the cellar stood white and skeletal against it like old bones. I scanned left to right, slow. At first I saw only ordinary shapes: post, rail, feed barrel, woodpile. Then a darker mass detached from the shadow between the sycamores and moved across the back slope with a gait that broke my brain for a second because it fit no category I used for living things around here. Upright but hunched, shoulder line too wide, head forward, lower legs angled backward at the joint like a canid standing on elongated feet. It took 3 silent strides and paused, torso twisting slightly as if sampling air. I lifted the lantern higher. The light did not reach that far, but the movement line stayed visible in moonwash, a cutout against pale fog. "Do you see that?" I said. Emmett did not answer right away. His breath came faster. "Yeah," he said at last. "Stay on the porch." The shape dropped to all 4s in one fluid motion, not clumsy, not like a man falling, more like a practiced shift between gears. Even low, its back rode higher than the top rail. It crossed 10 yards in 3 bounds and stopped near the fence corner where the cedar post leaned. I expected rattling wood, a bump, some contact noise. Instead, it gathered and cleared the whole fence in one motion, landing beyond it without touching the rail. Dust puffed off the topboard an instant later, untouched, still level. No black bear moves like that. Bears climb, lunge, bluff, crash through brush. This was quiet and precise, like watching a predator that understood geometry. It came upright again near the cellar path, half concealed by fog. Moonlight outlined the upper body now. Neck too vertical, chest heavy, forelimbs long enough that the hands hung near knee level when it stood. I could not see fur detail yet, just texture that broke the light unevenly. The head turned toward us and held. My skin went cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Every primitive warning system in me fired at once. I shouldered the rifle and realized I had forgotten to chamber a round. My fingers felt thick, clumsy. Emmett caught the mistake, grabbed the barrel, and pushed it down. "Not yet," he said, low and firm. "If you shoot and don't drop it, you bring it straight in." Lila called from behind the door, voice tight. "Russ?" "Inside," I said without looking back. "Now." She did not argue. I heard the deadbolt click. The shape moved again, quartering around the cellar at a measured pace, head dipping to the doors, then lifting toward the house, as if checking both in sequence. It stopped where moonlight hit the gouges and stood still long enough for me to feel what it was doing rather than merely see it. Assessing, patterning, testing whether light, noise, or movement changed our behavior. That calm in it scared me more than a charge would have. A gust pulled fog aside, and for half a second I got cleaner lines. Shoulders like an overbuilt lineman under a hide, spine sloping to digitigrade legs, tail low and thick. Then cloud crossed the moon and the yard went dim. In that dim, the silhouette melted backward toward the sycamores and disappeared piece by piece until only a black interruption remained, where black should have been continuous. Then that too was gone. We stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably less than a minute. Emmett set his lantern on the porch and rolled his bad knee once, a habit when pain climbed. "Generator," he said, "lights back on now." We moved fast. He primed and pulled. Engine caught on the second try. Floodlight over the back steps snapped bright. Then the side yard. Then the pole light by the machine shed. Illumination pushed shadows flat, but nothing stood in them. We did a full perimeter check from inside the fence with beams crossing, never splitting up, never losing line of sight. No fresh prints in the dry patches, only scuffed grass near the cellar and one broken weed stem at shoulder height by the path. Inside, Lila had both dogs in the hallway with leashes clipped and shoes on. Her bag sat by the door, ready. She looked at us and did not ask what we saw. She read it in our faces. We sat at the kitchen table until the main power returned around midnight. Nobody touched the chili. Nobody pretended this was Coyotes anymore. When Emmett finally went down to his trailer, he paused at the door and said, "If line power drops again, you do not come outside to investigate. I don't care what you hear." After he left, Lila leaned against me on the couch with both dogs pressed to our legs, and I kept replaying the fence jump, searching for angle tricks, depth errors, any misread I could live with. I built model after model in my head. Bear on a down slope that looked taller, two animals overlapping into one shape, moon shadow warping proportions. Each model failed on some small, hard detail, then failed again when matched against what Emmett had seen at the same time, from the same place. Near 2 a.m, when the house was finally quiet and the generators along the ridge had gone still, I stood at the kitchen window and stared at the sycamores until my eyes watered. I told myself it had been a stress hallucination built from darkness, fatigue, and old stories I had spent years mocking. I told myself real men did not let moonlight turn them superstitious. I told myself if I walked outside right then and checked the rail with a tape, I would find ordinary explanations waiting where fear had painted monsters. I did not open the door. I stood at that window until the glass chilled my forehead and the muscles in my jaw started to ache from clenching. The yard stayed empty, but the emptiness no longer looked clean. It looked occupied by something that had stepped out for a moment and would step back in when it pleased. Around 3, I made myself drink water, checked both locks again, and sat at the kitchen table with the rifle across my lap, while Buck and June lay under my chair with their heads on my boots. Dawn came slow and colorless. Lila had fallen asleep on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders and one hand still resting on June's leash. I woke her gently, told her to keep the dogs inside, and went out with Emmett to read sign before sun warmed the ground. The grass by the cellar was flattened in a crescent. There were no full prints on the hard patches, but near the runoff cut we got 2 partials clear enough to measure toe spread and depth. Front loaded, claw points sharp, heel trailing longer than a wolf track had any right to. I photographed both and bagged a small tuft of dark, coarse fur caught on the lower hinge pin. Emmett saw me do it and did not comment. At the porch post, shoulder height, we found 3 new scratches in the paint, shallow and exploratory, not the hard tearing on the cellar door. These were lighter, almost like test marks. On the 3rd step, dead center where my boot usually landed, sat my right work glove, palm up, clean except for one smear of wet dirt across the thumb seam. I had left that pair hanging in the mudroom on a nail the night before. I stared at the glove long enough that Emmett said my name twice. "Could have dropped it yesterday," he said. "Not there," I said. "I did not wear these yesterday." He shifted his weight off his bad knee and looked toward the trees. Then something carried it. Neither of us said what that implied. Lila called from the porch that coffee was getting cold, and we came in without the glove. I used a shovel to lift it into a feed sack and tied the top shut. Evidence was starting to feel less like reassurance, and more like records for a trial nobody wanted to hold. By the next evening, rain had returned, in bands that moved through fast, hard for 10 minutes, and then gone, leaving steam rising off the gravel. I went to my shift because staying home had not made us safer, and because routine, even broken routine, gave me a spine to lean against. I clocked out at 4:15, drove the ridge road with both windows cracked despite the cold, so I could hear outside noise over the engine, and turned into the hollow as first light hinted behind cloud cover. Halfway down the lane, I noticed the motion light by the porch pulsing on and off in the distance. On, off, on, off. No pattern tied to wind or rain. I pulled in slow and killed the engine without opening the door. The yard smelled like wet leaves, and that same iron musk taint concentrated near the cellar path. Buck barked from inside the house, but June made a thin keening sound that raised the hair on my arms. Emmett's trailer window was lit, meaning he was up and watching too. I went inside, showered, slept in blocks, and woke at dusk with a pressure behind my ribs that felt like waiting for a verdict. Lila asked me not to go out alone. I said I was only checking lights in line. She looked at my face and knew I was lying to myself as much as to her. Emmett came up right after supper with a coil of extension cord and said, "We are doing this together or not at all." We set the truck in the upper yard, pointed downhill. Headlights aimed across the back slope toward the sycamores and cellar. I left the engine running. Emmett took the porch with a lantern and his old 12 gauge. I stayed by the truck bed with my rifle and a handheld spotlight, far enough apart that one charge would not pin both of us, close enough for crossfire lanes if it came in straight. Lila stayed inside with both dogs, phone in hand, keys in her pocket, front door unlocked for fast movement. We had planned all that in plain language before stepping out. Planning did not settle my nerves, but it gave fear rails to run on. For 20 minutes, nothing happened except rain ticking on metal. Then the motion sensor near the back steps snapped bright. No movement visible. It cut out. 5 seconds later, the side yard sensor lit. Cut out. Then the pole light by the machine shed flickered twice and held. The sequence ran from left to right across the property like somebody pacing just inside each arc and timing exits. Stop. Wait. Trigger. Retreat. Emmett said quietly, "It is mapping blind spots." I clicked the truck to high beams. White light washed the grass and blew long shadows toward the creek cut. At first I caught only fence rails, rain sheen, and fog lifting in ribbons. Then, maybe 40 yards out near the second sycamore, a form slipped from black to gray for half a second and froze broadside. That was the first clean partial view, and there was no way to file it under bear, wolf, man, or misread. The head carried an elongated snout, narrow at the bridge and widening toward the nose, with wet fur matted to the muzzle in spikes. The ears stood high but not symmetrical, one torn along the outer edge as if ripped and healed rough. The neck rose too upright for any quadruped, not swan long, just wrong in angle, supporting the head like a thing built to look over obstacles while standing. Shoulders were massive and rounded under slick black-brown fur, heavier than a large man in winter layers. But the forelimbs dropped in a way no man's arms did, long and powerful, ending in hands that opened and closed around empty air, with articulated fingers tipped by pale hooked claws. Not paws, hands built for grasping. Rain beaded on the coat and ran in channels through old scar tissue on the right forearm, a raised pale ridge from elbow toward wrist where fur grew thin. That scar caught the headlights and flashed lighter each time the limb moved. It took one sideways step with measured control, set weight on the scarred arm, tested and shifted off it again, as if guarding old damage, without surrendering speed. The rear legs were digitigrade, hock joint high, heel lifted, giving it a coiled posture even while still. Every proportion announced power and efficiency for short, violent movement. I remember my own breathing went shallow and fast, but the thing's chest moved slow. In, out. Deliberate. Its eyes reflected amber green when the beams hit at direct angle, then dulled when it tipped its head to reduce glare. Adaptive behavior. Not startle. Not confusion. It watched our lights the way a hunter studies another hunter's stance. "Russ," Emmett said, voice low and tight. "Do not fire unless it commits." "I know." "You hit center mass, you might not anchor it." "I know." It tested us for nearly a minute. 2 steps into light, pause, 1 step back to shadow, pause. Each motion changed what sensors tripped. When the porch light came on, it held outside the cone and waited for timeout before crossing that edge again. When I swung the spotlight left, it moved right. When I held steady, it stopped moving at all and let rain and fog erase its outline until only the eye shine gave it away. That was the moment I stopped thinking in terms of animal nuisance and started thinking in terms of an intelligence problem with teeth. The creature lowered briefly to all fours and flowed 3 yards down slope without sound, then rose upright behind a feeder barrel and angled its head toward the kitchen window where Lila stood behind the curtain. I saw the eyes track that exact rectangle of light and felt something primal rip through me. Not abstract fear, but ownership panic, the old mammal wiring that says this is den. These are mine. This line gets held. I slammed the spotlight full on its face. It did not bolt. It narrowed one eye against the beam, bared teeth without opening the jaws fully, and tapped the cellar door once with those long claws. A quick metallic knock on reinforced wood. A signal. A reminder. Then it stepped backward into fog and vanished, one section at a time. Snout last. We held positions another 15 minutes. No movement returned. The sensors went quiet. Rain softened to mist. When we finally regrouped at the porch, my knees shook hard enough that I had to set the rifle on the rail to keep it from rattling against the wood. Lila opened the door and looked past us, searching for shape in the yard. "Tell me exactly what you saw," I said. "Snout. Hands. Scarred forearm. Torn ear. It was looking at the house, not wandering." She swallowed and nodded once. Emmett wiped rain from his face and said, "It is not bluffing territory anymore. It is probing." We went inside and locked up. I wrote every detail in a spiral notebook at the table while it was fresh. Distance estimate, light source, limb movement, scar location, ear tear, behavior sequence with sensor triggers. My handwriting slanted downhill by the end because adrenaline crash hit all at once. When I stood to refill coffee, Buck growled low at the back door and then looked not at the yard, but at the mudroom. The mudroom light was off. I turned it on and stopped in the doorway. My lunch pail, which I had left on the shelf by the washer, sat on the floor directly against the threshold as if staged for me to trip over. The lid was open. Inside, my thermos was gone. So was the small pocket knife Lila had given me for our first anniversary, the one with walnut scales and my initials burned into the handle. The nail above the bench where I kept my spare cap was empty too. One wet paw-like smear marked the bench edge, and below it, 4 shallow scratches ran down the painted wood in parallel lines, spaced to match the cellar gouges at smaller depth. I checked every window and door, all locked. No broken glass, no pried frame. The back door weather strip, though, had fresh compression near the lower corner, as if pressure had flexed it just enough for a hand to work fingers through and lift the inner mudroom latch we sometimes left hooked when carrying groceries. I had unhooked it earlier out of habit and forgotten to reset. A 2-second mistake. Lila stood behind me and saw the open pail. "Where's your thermos?" "Gone." She looked at the scratches and pressed both palms to her temples. "Russ, that was inside the house. Inside the mudroom." "That is still inside." Emmett came in, crouched, and sniffed the air near the bench the way old hunters do when they are verifying what they already know. "Same musk. Fresh." I said, "It did this while we were outside with lights on it." He nodded. "Or while we were focused on one angle and it used another." The underlying truth landed with a weight that made the room tilt for a second. We had been treating the property like a perimeter problem. It was already past perimeter when it chose. That changed the whole equation. I moved through the house, methodically after that, checking closets, underbeds, attic hatch, every cabinet big enough to hide movement, not because I expected to find it crouched behind winter coats, but because action kept panic from freezing me. Once clear, I set chairs under both doorknobs, ran paracord through handles and tied them to anchor points, and laid a strip of dry flour across each threshold to capture any overnight disturbance. Emmett did the same at his trailer and called up from the porch to confirm he had eyes on our back steps from his window. No heroics, No solo checks. 3 nights later, on my drive home before dawn, I noticed a dark shape pacing the timber line, parallel to the road for almost a quarter mile, visible only when my headlights cut through brakes in brush. It kept my speed without crossing into open ground. When I accelerated, it disappeared, then reappeared farther ahead near the old culvert where the lane bends toward our mailbox. Not chance, not random crossing. Escort behavior. I reached the house and sat in the truck, the doors locked and engine idling until Emmett flashed his porch light twice, our agreed signal that his lane was clear. Even then, when I walked to the steps, I did it with the rifle angled low and my shoulders tight, scanning windows, roof line, and sycamore gap in one loop every 3 seconds. Predators teach by repetition. It had been teaching us its range, its patience, and our blind spots. That morning, standing on my own porch, with coal grit still under my nails, and my missing knife somewhere in the woods, I finally accepted the point I had fought from the first gouge on the cellar door. It was not circling the property anymore. It was circling me. It was circling me, and once I admitted that out loud in my own head, denial stopped being a shield and started being a liability. I went back inside, locked the mudroom door behind me, and found Lila standing by the stove with both hands flat on the counter like she was bracing for impact. Emmett came up the steps a minute later, wet at the shoulders from mist, shotgun broken open in one hand. None of us spoke for a few seconds. Buck paced between us in tight loops, and June stayed pressed against Lila's knees, trembling hard enough to shake her tag. "I'm calling the sheriff now," I said. I put the call on speaker so they could hear it. Dispatch picked up on the third ring, took the address, then asked the same sequence I had already answered with wildlife. Livestock losses, confirmed injury, visible animal now. I said there had been forced entry into the mudroom, property damage, stalking behavior, and an active threat to occupants. The woman on the line stayed professional, but her tone shifted when I said, "Not bear movement, not coyote movement." "Nearest unit is handling a rollover near county line," she said. "Estimated response is delayed. Secure your residence and avoid exterior contact." "How delayed?" "Could be 2 hours. Could be longer if weather turns." Emmett leaned in toward the phone. "Ma'am, this thing is testing doors." A pause. Keyboard clicks. "Sir, if you feel in immediate danger, evacuate to a public location." The call ended with a case number and advice I could have printed off a website. I wrote the number on the back of an electric bill and stuck it under a magnet, because busy hands helped me keep from shaking. I tried county wildlife again. Straight to voicemail. I called Hank Bell from the hardware store because he lived 10 miles downridge and kept a sidearm in his truck year-round. He answered groggy, listened 30 seconds, then said, "Russ, dawn fear gets loud on no sleep. Lock up and ride it out." I hung up before I said something I would regret and tossed the phone onto the couch harder than I meant to. By noon, the cloud ceiling had dropped to the ridge tops and a drizzle settled in that never quite became rain but soaked everything anyway. I did a daylight sweep with Emmett, both of us armed, both of us keeping each other in view. The truck had new scratches along the rear quarter panel at hip height, 4 lines, shallow but clean, laid in like a signature. At the fence corner where I'd seen it pause the night before, we found my missing thermos upright in the grass with the lid unscrewed and set beside it. No dents, no chew marks, placed The pocket knife was not there. Near the sycamores, Emmett stopped and pointed to a patch of mud where runoff from the hill had pooled and then settled. 2 full impressions held clear enough to cast without guessing. Long forefoot, deep claw punctures, and that stretched heel shape I had been arguing with for days. I took photos, set the tape, mixed plaster in a bucket with rainwater, poured, and wrote the time on masking tape across each cast. Evidence still mattered, but now it felt like making receipts while the store burned. When we came back up, Lila had packed both vehicles and lined gear by the front door. Medical kit, flashlights, chargers, 2 blankets, folder with deed copies, our marriage certificate, insurance cards, and enough cash for gas in a motel if cards failed. She looked at me and said, "If we have to run, we run clean." I nodded. Agreed. Emmett stood in the doorway, staring past us at the back slope. Road out can be cut off if creek jumps banks. If it pins us here after dark, truck is plan B. "What's plan A?" I asked. He hesitated, then jerked his chin toward the cellar. "Door and winch." I turned to him. "You've been hinting around that thing for 2 weeks. Talk straight." He rubbed his thumb over his lower lip, then finally gave it to us. My daddy reinforced that cellar after a bad winter in '78. Not for weather. For this. He rigged the old winch chain to swing the outer door full open fast, like a steel gate. You pull from the post and it snaps out with all the hinge weight behind it. "You trap it in the arc," I said. "If timing is right." Lila stared at both of us like we had started speaking another language. "You had a trap this whole time and said nothing." Emmett did not defend himself. "I had a last resort. There's a difference." By late afternoon, the drizzle thickened into steady rain, and the hollow started to close in around us. Cell signal dropped from 2 bars to 1, then vanished entirely, unless I stood on the front step, with my phone held shoulder high. The line power blinked twice. I rolled the truck forward and tested the headlights, hazard lights, and battery. Good. I checked my shotgun and loaded slug rounds, 2 in the tube, 1 chambered, safety on. Emmett topped off a red diesel can for the generator and set it by the porch post. He also laid 2 road flares on the rail, capped and dry. At supper, nobody ate much. Lila forced down half a sandwich and fed scraps to neither dog for once, as if routine itself might jinx us. Buck refused food anyway. June took 1 bite and walked away. Animals had been ahead of us from the start. Around 8, the rain slowed, and that was worse. Water noise had at least masked smaller sounds. In the lull, every click and creak from the woods carried sharp. I stepped onto the porch for a signal check and got 1 bar long enough to send a text to the sheriff case number with "active threat returned" and our address again. Message failed twice, then sent on the 3rd attempt. No reply came. At 8:47, the back motion light flashed once and died. Not timed out. Dead. A second later, the side yard light died too, then the pole light by the machine shed went dark and stayed dark. Main power to the house remained on, kitchen windows still glowing behind me, so whatever failed was localized to exterior lines. Emmett came up beside me with his shotgun. "It's cutting visibility." "Can it do that?" "You saw the mudroom latch. Stop asking what it can't do." Lila opened the door with both dog leashes in her hand and said, "Truck now. We go to town." We moved fast, and that was when the first impact hit the porch from below. Not a jump onto boards, but a slam into the support posts, hard enough to rattle the whole structure. Buck yelped. June flattened to the floor. Lila stumbled into me, and I caught her by the elbow while Emmett swung his light down the steps. Nothing in the beam. Rain sheen, empty yard, railing vibrating from the hit. Then came one heavy footfall at the cellar path, another by the sycamores, a third behind the truck. It was hurting us. I grabbed Lila's shoulders and looked her straight in the face. Inside, lock in, take the dogs to the hallway. If I say run, you run for the passenger side and do not look back. She opened her mouth to argue, saw something in my expression and shut it again. Don't leave me out here, she said, then backed inside with the leashes and dead-bolted the door. Emmett and I split like we had rehearsed it. He cut right toward the winch post by the cellar, staying low. I moved left to the truck, yanked the door open, and kicked the headlights to high beam with the engine roaring. White light washed the slope and threw hard shadows of every rail, post, and sapling. The shape stood between the sycamores and the cellar, fully in the beams for the first time. The hollow hound stood in the beams, all of Emmett's refusals made flesh. 7.5 feet when upright, maybe a little more with its head high. Digitigrade legs, loaded like springs, hocks high and angular, feet long with splayed toes tipped in dark curved claws. Its torso was barrel thick, rib cage broad enough that both headlights caught fur across the chest at once. Wet, black-brown coat hung in matted ridges along the shoulders and spine, with thinner patches over old scars that ran pale under the hide. The right forelimb carried that raised scar ridge I had seen earlier, textured like rope under skin, and even injured it moved with controlled power. Its hands were the worst part to accept. 5 long fingers, thumbs set low but functional, each ending in a claw around 3 inches. Pale at the tips, where they had stripped paint and wood. The neck rose unnaturally vertical from those shoulders, supporting a wolf-like head with an elongated muzzle, black nose flared wide, lips pulled tight enough that teeth showed even with jaws closed. Ears were tall and ragged, left ear torn along the outer edge. Eyes burned amber in direct light and shifted green at the margins, not glowing on their own, but reflecting with an intensity that made them seem lit from inside. It looked at me, then at Emmett, then at the kitchen window behind me, where Lila stood back in shadow, tracking priorities, calculating angles. The smell hit a second later, heavy musk, wet fur, and that metallic tang like old tools left in blood and rain. I had seen predators lock on to prey before. I had never seen one do it with that kind of patient focus. It dropped to all fours and moved 10 feet so fast my eyes lagged behind it. No wasted motion. Shoulder blades rolling under hide, claws cutting dark lines through wet soil. Then upright again in one fluid surge, close enough now that I heard breath pull through its teeth. Emmett shouted from the winch post, "Russell, draw it!" I hit the horn and screamed at it, raw and loud, banging the truck fender with my palm. "Come on then, here!" Its head snapped toward me. Weight shifted forward. That coiled pause predators take right before commitment. It charged. I shouldered the shotgun, set front sight on the scarred forelimb, and fired one slug. Muzzle flash lit rain into silver needles. The round struck high on the right arm and spun it half sideways. It did not fall. It screamed, a deep tearing sound that rattled my sternum, then drove forward anyway, now angling across me toward the porch, where Lila was. I racked and fired the second slug into the shoulder pocket as it crossed the cellar arc. The hit checked its momentum for a fraction. Enough. Now, I yelled. Emmett yanked the winch release with both hands and dropped his weight backward. Chain screamed over the drum. The reinforced cellar door, already unlatched and preloaded, swung outward like a steel-backed battering ram. It caught the creature at thigh and hip, slammed it sideways into the stone retaining wall, and pinned the scarred forelimb between edge and concrete. Wood cracked. Metal rang. The thing thrashed and clawed, gouging deep tracks across the door face, each line matching the old marks that had started this whole nightmare. "Diesel!" Emmett shouted, voice breaking. The red can sat 3 feet from my boot. I grabbed it, sloshed fuel in a wide arc across the pinned side of the door and the ground at the creature's feet, and kicked the can clear. My hands were slick, fingers numb. But one road flare came free on the first strike. Red fire hissed to life in my fist. I threw it low. Flame hit Diesel and flashed up in a rolling orange sheet. Not an explosion that tore the yard apart, but a violent whoosh that swallowed the door arc and forced heat across my face like opening a furnace. The creature convulsed, tore its trapped limb free in a spray of splinters, and launched backward through the fire line, fur smoking along one side. It landed badly, recovered on 3 limbs, and bolted downslope toward the creek cut, half leap, half stagger, screaming in bursts that echoed off the hollow walls. I chased 3 steps, then stopped at the edge because the ground dropped steep and slick there, and a broken ankle would have ended us. In the truck beams, I saw it hit the drainage run where old mine water carved a channel under shale. It tried to clear the gap, slipped on wet rock, and slammed into the lip of the abandoned drainage shaft, hidden by brush. Brush gave way. Weight carried forward. The whole upper section collapsed with it, and the body dropped into darkness with a cascade of shale and rotten timber. Then silence. No scrambling claws. No second impact climbing out. Just rain ticking on leaves and the hiss of burning diesel dying down around the cellar. I kept the shotgun trained on the shaft opening while Emmett came up beside me breathing hard, face gray, left sleeve torn and streaked from splinters. We waited for movement that did not come. After a full minute, he said, "It's down." Or waiting, maybe both. From inside the house, Lila pounded the door once and shouted my name. I turned, ran to the porch, and got her and the dogs moving in one line to the truck like we had drilled it. She saw the fire scorch on the cellar, saw Emmett's sleeve, saw my hands shaking, and did not ask questions. Not yet. We climbed in, locked doors, and rolled out with headlights wide and horn ready, tires spitting mud down the lane. At the mailbox, I looked back once. The house lights were still on. The cellar door hung crooked, blackened and scarred, smoke drifting in thin ribbons. Beyond it, the sycamores stood pale in the rain, and below them the creek cut swallowed the shaft opening whole. By the time we hit the highway, my pulse finally started to drop, and the tremor in my hands got so bad I had to grip the wheel at the base to keep straight. Emmett pressed a towel to a claw graze on his forearm. Lila held both leashes and kept one hand on my shoulder, firm and steady as if anchoring me to the seat. The immediate threat was behind us, at least for that night, and we were still breathing. That was all I trusted in that moment. 10 minutes later, I pulled under the canopy at the Highway 17 gas station, the one with a 24-hour counter and cameras pointed at every pump lane. The fluorescent lights made all of us look washed out and older. I parked facing the store, left the engine running, and tried to take my hands off the wheel. They would not unclench. Lila reached over, peeled my fingers free one at a time, and said my name until I looked at her. Emmett opened his door and nearly went to one knee from his bad leg and the new cut in his forearm. The towel he had pressed there was dark and wet, but the bleeding was not pumping. Splinters and claw grazes, like he said. Mine were across my left knuckles and wrist where flying wood had caught me by the cellar. The clerk came out before I could decide whether to call again or drive straight to town clinic. He took one look at Emmett's arm and said, "You all need a medic." I said, "We are going. But I need you to see us here first, on camera right now." He nodded slow, confused, but he understood enough to wave us closer to the glass. I bought 3 bottled waters I did not want just to force a time-stamped receipt. While he rang it up, I asked him to print 2 copies. He did, no argument. Evidence had become muscle memory. In the parking lot, Lila cleaned my hand with napkins and water, jaw set, eyes bright and dry. "You are shaking," she said. "So are you." "I can still hold things, can you?" I tried to pick up the cap from the truck bed rail and dropped it twice. Emmett watched that, then said, "Clinic first. Talking later." The county emergency clinic sat off the bypass. Bright waiting room, vending machines humming, 2 tired nurses on overnight rotation. We signed in at 1:12 in the morning. I wrote animal attack on the intake line and forced my pen not to gouge the paper. They brought Emmett back first for irrigation and stitches. I got 6 stitches across the wrist, 3 steri strips on the knuckles, and a tetanus shot that made my shoulder burn by sunrise. Lila had bruising at the elbow and a deep scrape on her shin from the porch stumble. Nothing broken. The doctor on duty asked what animal, and I said, "Large unidentified predator." He held my gaze, then typed exactly that. By 5:30, the adrenaline was gone, and shock took over clean. My teeth chattered though the room was warm. A paper cup of coffee rattled against my teeth so hard I set it down untouched. Lila sat beside me in the discharge area with her hand on my knee. Emmett came out with a gauze wrap and a borrowed sling, moved stiff but upright. For the first time all night, he looked directly at me and said, "You did what needed doing?" No dramatic tone. Just a fact placed between us like a tool on a bench. At 6:04, while dawn was still gray behind the clinic blinds, I called the sheriff line with the case number from the electric bill scrap in my wallet. I kept it plain. Active threat, property breach, direct attack, shots fired in defense, injuries treated, scene preserved as much as possible. The deputy on the phone asked if the animal was still on site. I said it went down a mine drainage shaft after a fire barrier, and I had no visual confirmation after collapse. He said, "Do not return alone. Unit will meet you there." I said, "We are not going back without you?" They met us at the lane just after 8. 2 deputies, one older, one fresh-faced, both wearing expressions that sat between concern and skepticism until they saw the cellar. The older deputy walked the scorched line, measured the gouges with a folding ruler, photographed every door face, and bagged my spent slug holes from where I pointed in the mud by the truck ruts. The younger one stood at the shaft edge with a long branch and tested depth where the brush had collapsed. He pulled the branch back slick with black mine water and shale grit and said quietly, "Nothing climbing out here this morning." I gave them my phone photos, the print videos with tape for scale, and locations of the cast sites. They took digital copies, but left me the originals. Wildlife arrived near noon, 2 officers in rain shells. They looked at track casts, looked at the door, and used the phrase probable black bear 3 times in 20 minutes, even while one of them admitted the heel geometry was atypical. Their report language stayed cautious in a way that erased more than it explained. Large bear, distorted sign due to substrate, defensive discharge by homeowner. Closed pending a new incident. I did not argue on scene because I needed a filed record, and filed records come from staying inside the lines officials can accept. But I built my own archive that same evening at my kitchen table while Lila slept sitting up with both dogs against her legs. I labeled and boxed everything. Plaster casts from creek and sycamore mud, photos printed with dates, the dark fur in a zip bag, the glove from the feed sack, screenshots of call logs to Dispatch and Wildlife, receipt copies from the gas station, clinic discharge papers, shell casing photos, and the evidence voucher number from the deputy, plus my spiral notebook with behavior sequences and times. I put all of it in a locking tote under the bed at the Hollow House. 2 days later, County Wildlife finally returned my voicemail from earlier in the week, the one from before the attack. Same polite cadence, same recommendation about securing pet food and trash. I asked the officer if he had read the updated report and seen the door impacts. He said yes, then said, "Bears can surprise you with reach and force." I thanked him and ended the call because there was no productive lane left. Hank Bell called that night after hearing from somebody at the gas station. He cleared his throat twice and said, "I should not have brushed you off." I said, "You were working with normal categories." He said, "You still got that footage?" I said, "Yes." He did not ask to see it. On the 3rd evening after the attack, with the rain finally gone and the ridge visible again, Emmett came up to our kitchen, sat down without taking his cap off, and told the part he had carried alone for decades. His father saw the same thing in the winter of '78 near that same cellar door. Not a rumor, not a maybe. He saw it stand upright in lantern light, watched it rake the door, and found livestock mauled in ways he never wrote down. He reinforced the door, rigged the winch swing, and told Emmett one rule: keep children inside when dogs go silent. He said naming it gives it room in your head, Emmett told me, staring at his hands. Silence felt safer than panic. I used the same rule on you and Lila. I was wrong about that part. He looked up then. You needed the full map. By the 2nd week of November, Lila and I sat across from a banker in town and signed papers to sell my share of coal equipment and terminate my night shift contract. I left the prep plant before Thanksgiving, first voluntary quit of my adult life. We rented a duplex 40 miles away in a small town with close neighbors, street lights, and steady cell coverage. The first night there, I slept 4 straight hours and woke guilty for feeling relief. Buck and June adjusted faster than we did. They still watched tree lines, but they stopped refusing doorways. The life changes were not dramatic declarations. They were practical layers installed one decision at a time. I stopped solo hunting at dusk. I kept range practice only in daylight at a supervised lane outside town. I mounted motion lights at every corner of the duplex, door sensors on both entries, a camera over the back lot, and white noise machines in bedroom and hall because sudden night silence still snapped me awake. I mapped exits in every building I entered, counted steps to doors in restaurants without meaning to, and parked nose out anywhere I could. Lila and I kept go bags by the closet, not because we expected a repeat in town, but because having a plan cut down the helplessness. Emmett stayed in the hollow through winter to finish what he called the only job that mattered. He hired a dozer crew, capped the drainage shaft with rebar grid, concrete, and truckloads of riprap, then buried that section under compacted fill and scrap stone. I went out for one full day to help weld interior steel, bracing onto the cellar frame and replace the outer doors with plate-backed hardwood. We worked in near silence until sunset, then sat on overturned buckets by the shed heater and drank burnt coffee. Shared secrecy had changed shape by then. It was less about pride, more about contingency. He sold the property in early spring to a timber company that wanted access rights, not residents. In the disclosure packet, he listed storm damage, structural reinforcement, and old mine hazard. He did not list what chased us to the highway. I understood why. Paper has categories, and some truths refuse them. I work day shift now at an outdoor supply warehouse off Route 11, forklifts and inventory scanners instead of conveyors and midnight alarms. I can do that job well. I joke with co-workers, lift what needs lifting, clock out on time. Twice a month I sit in a therapist's office above a pharmacy and talk plainly about hypervigilance, startle response, and the difference between caution and captivity. The work is not quick, but it is honest. Sleep is better than it was. Not perfect, better. Lila and I are still together. Stronger in some ways, quieter in others. She believed me fully after she saw the porch damage, heard the scream, and watched deputies photograph those doors. We do not unpack details after dark. That boundary is not avoidance so much as respect for what night does to memory. We still visit Emmett every other Sunday at his new place near town. He keeps his forearm scar uncovered and never comments on it and checks my door locks by habit when he comes over. I let him. As for the evidence cache, it remains intact and accounted for. After we relocated in November, I moved the locking tote from under the bed at the hollow house to our town duplex. One cast cracked during our move. I wrapped and kept both halves. Deputies retained 2 shell casings tied to their incident file and returned one deformed slug fragment they recovered near the retaining wall. The first sample stayed in my lockbox after a private lab in Lexington declined species identification due to contamination risk and chain of custody gaps. My glove remains bagged. The thermos came back from the yard and still carries a faint dent I do not remember putting there. The anniversary pocket knife never turned up, despite 3 daylight sweeps and a metal detector pass before Emmett sold. I marked it in the notebook as unrecovered and stopped pretending I would get it back. You wanted the ending complete, so here it is, complete. I survived. Lila survived. Emmett survived. The immediate threat in that hollow ended the night it went through the shaft and did not come back out. Our lives did not return to old shape, but they did continue in a shape we built on purpose. I am physically safe, employed, housed, and no longer arguing with what I saw in those headlights. I do not debate categories anymore. I track behavior, exits, and distance. When I drive through wooded country now and every bird call cuts off at once, I do not call it imagination. I roll my windows up, check mirrors, and keep moving. The world stayed larger and darker than I was raised to admit, and I learned to live inside that knowledge without letting it own me. The only question I still carry is not whether the hollow hound was real. The question is whether the shaft held for good. And I built my life so I never have to go back and test that answer myself.